lake trout restoration in Lake Michigan continues to be a good news story through year 2019. This is a multi-agency effort with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Little Traverse Bay Bands of Ottawa Indians, Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians, Sioux Tribe, Little River Band of Ottawa Indians, Michigan DNR, Indiana DNR, Wisconsin DNR, Illinois DNR, and also a couple of other members from the Michigan State University and University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. So a whole bunch of agencies involved with getting the data together in this report together. This report is based on GillNet assessment surveys conducted at these 11 lake-wide assessment plan sites and 3 supplemental sites pictured on this map here. In addition, we will present some of the data from the Great Lakes Mass Marking Program, which will be the lake trout that are from recreationally caught lake trout. And then finally, we will also present some of the results from statistical catch at age models applied to lake trout populations in the lake. So moving on to the fish community objectives, the first one being to establish a diverse salmonine community capable of sustaining an annual harvest of 2.7 to 6.8 million kilograms, 20 to 25% of which being lake trout. Well, the first part of that fish community objectives has been achieved during the years 2013 to 2019, as that lake trout annual harvest ranged between 0.54 million and 1.7 million kilograms. However, the second part, according to the numbers that we have, in 2018 and 2019, the lake trout percentage of that total salmonine harvest exceeded 25%, as shown in these following figures. So if you look at the first panel, we see that the lake trout annual harvest is between the guidelines for that first part of the community objectives. It's in that 0.54 to 1.7 million kilogram range. However, in the last 2 years, the lake trout percentage of that total salmonine harvest has exceeded 25%. And that, I'm not sure that agrees with what Nick presented earlier. We'll have to get to the bottom of that, but that's the numbers that we have for the total harvest. Moving on to another fish community objective, which is to establish a self-sustaining lake trout population. Considerable progress has been made on this front for sure. According to the Great Lakes Mass Marking Program, 38% of the lake trout in Lake Michigan in 2019 were unclipped fish and presumably wild fish. Meanwhile, based on the spring and fall assessment surveys, 21% of the fish were unclipped or presumably wild. Now, we think the actual number is probably in between, because the Great Lakes Mass Marking Program, a lot of the recreational harvest is from the southern part, so there's a somewhat of a bias to the south in that index, and then there's somewhat of a bias to the north in the assessment surveys. And since most of the wild fish are emanating from the south, we probably have to average those two percentages to get what the actual percentage is out in the lake. So we're probably talking somewhere around 30% wild fish in Lake Michigan based on that average. Now, of those fish that were unclipped, the highest percentage is in the Illinois waters, 37 to 64%, followed by MM7 and 8, which are districts in the south on the Michigan side, 34 to 56% there, and then the Southern Refuge or the Mid-Lake Refuge with 29 to 37%. The percent unclipped in the northern waters remains low at 2 to 9%. And so in this graph, the black represents the assessment surveys and the red represents the Great Lakes Mass Marking Program, which are the recreationally caught fish. And we see the rises, the increases in recent years in Illinois waters for sure, and then also see MM7 and 8, big increases, and then finally the WM4 and 5, which would be close to the Southern Refuge. We see the increases there. So that's where a lot of the wild fish in the lake are coming from. Now, if we were to look at the age distribution of those wild lake trout caught in the assessment surveys in 2019, the indication is that the beginning of detectable production of wild lake trout began sometime around 2005. So this is a fairly healthy sample of 429 lake trout from those that were unclipped in 2019. And the ages are ranging from 1 all the way up to 12 plus, but the indication is that that would make the beginning of the natural reproduction beginning sometime around 2005. Also, additional evidence for a self-sustaining lake trout population comes from the study by Dale Hansen and others with looking at the winter bycatches of lake trout and bottom trawls and gill nets during 2011 and 2014 this is for targeting bloaters. We see that about 20% of the lake trout bycatch was unclipped. Then if we look at the bottom trawl survey conducted by the USGS Great Lakes Science Center, since 2008, 108 of the 163 lake trout that were caught in the bottom trawl, or 66%, were unclipped. And if we compare that with what we saw prior to 2008, we would see that prior to 2008, less than 2% of those lake trout caught in the bottom trawl survey were unclipped. So a big surge after about 2008 with the percent wild in the bottom trawl survey. And the bottom trawl survey began on a lake-wide basis back in 1973. And then also, since 2010, 29 age 0 wild lake trout were caught in the Great Lakes Science Center bottom trawl survey. So the beginning of the natural reproduction coincides with relatively low alewife abundance in the lake. Again, if we remember that the production of wild lake trout began sometime around 2005, that's just the time when alewife abundance in the lake was low, and it might have even gotten lower since that time. Now, according to the strategy, the maximum for the lake trout annual stocking rate is 3.53 million yearling equivalents per year, and the interim target was set at 2.74 million yearling equivalents, and that was later dropped to 2.54. We never exceeded the maximum, did exceed the interim for a while, but we've now dropped below that interim target during 2018 and 2019. And this is all shown in these figures here. Again, the highest lake-wide annual stocking rates were in that 2010 to 2016 time period. Also a pretty good rate in 2007 as well. And since 2016, there's been about somewhere between a 15 and 20% drop in the lake-wide stocking rate, annual stocking rate. According to the strategy, annual total mortality for lake trout between ages 6 and 11 should not exceed 40%. And we see that in MM1, 2, and 3. In 2016, that mortality rate was estimated to be 43% and 45% in 2017. So we're getting close to hitting that target annual mortality rate in the north in MM1, 2, and 3. And this is all from the statistical catch at age modeling. Now, we now have mortality rate estimates for non-treaty waters, and that's from the effort by Rick Clark and Jim Bentz for a recently funded study from the Great Lakes Fishery Trust, and that is for the Wisconsin 3, 4, and 5 districts. And that in that combination of districts, the annual mortality rate was below that target level since 1999. And presently, we're at a real low level of just 14%. And that's all shown in these plots here. If we look at the top panel, we see a substantial reduction in the sea lamprey-induced mortality rate on lake trout and MM1, 2, and 3 between 2011 and 2017, and also somewhat of a drop in the fishing mortality in the last few years. And then, of course, we see the big drop in mortality rate in WI 3, 4, and 5 from 1999, with the big drop in the recreational or fishing mortality there. Now on to the evaluation objectives, the first one being that the mean CPE from the spring LWOP surveys should be greater than 25 lake trout per 1,000 feet of net. And the evaluation from the assessment surveys indicates that we're not close to meeting that objective on a lake-wide basis, although we do see that target level being met in the Southern Refuge in 2019. But overall, we're not meeting that objective. And that's all shown in these plots here. The black represents the multi-filament gill nets in the spring LWOP survey. The red represents the monofilament gill nets in that spring survey. And the blue line is for the CPE based on the multi-filament nets. And so you can see that overall we're well below, in most areas, we're well below that threshold or target of 25 fish per 1,000 feet of net. But in the Southern Refuge, we do exceed it now and then, and in 2019, we did exceed it, that limit. But overall, we're not exceeding that target level of 25 fish per 1,000 feet of net. Evaluation objective 2 is that the mean CPE from the fall spawner survey should exceed 50 fish per 1,000 feet of net. And happy to report that the lake-wide average is well above that target level of 50 fish per 1,000 feet of net. The highest levels are in the Southern Refuge, where we routinely exceed 120 fish per 1,000 feet of net. But we're now seeing a relatively high level in the Northern Refuge. In 2019, we hit the level of 74 fish per 1,000 feet of net. So again, the black line is from the multi-filament gill nets. They're all multi-filament in the fall. And the blue line is the CPE of the wild fish. In contrast to the spring nets, we see substantial CPEs for wild fish in the fall nets. And if you look at the Illinois plot, we now have hit 76 fish wild lake trout per 1,000 feet of net in Illinois waters, and in the Southern Refuge, 44 fish per 1,000 feet of net, 44 wild lake trout per 1,000 feet of net. So some pretty substantial numbers of for CPE of wild lake trout, an overall increasing trend in Illinois, and a dramatic, very dramatic increase in the Northern Refuge, more than 10-fold in the last 5 years, probably closer to 15-fold in the Northern Refuge for fall spawner abundance of lake trout. Evaluation objective 3 is for at least 25% of the lake trout caught in the fall spawner gill nets to be females, and of those fish caught in the fall spawner nets, that there should be at least 10 or more age groups older than age 7. Well, on a lake-wide basis, we certainly see more than 25% of that fall spawner catch being females, and that 10 age groups older than age 7 has been documented at the Southern Refuge, Julian's Reef, Waukegan Reef, and Sturgeon Bay in the past. And we are getting closer to meeting that target in MM3, MM4, and MM6. So again, looking at the percent female, we have been meeting that objective since 1998 of over 25% female in the fall spawner nets. And then if we look at the age composition in the Sturgeon Bay area, WM3, we are meeting that objective, but each year we get closer and closer to meeting it in MM3, MM4, and MM6. Evaluation objective 4 is to detect a minimum density of 500 viable lake trout eggs per meter squared, and those eggs should have thymine concentrations greater than 4 nanomoles per gram. When we do measure lake trout egg densities, we don't get close, we're well below that threshold level or target level of 500 eggs per meter squared. So we're not even close to that when eggs are being measured. However, in general, the thymine concentrations in the eggs have exceeded 4 nanomoles per gram during 2005 to 2018. In 2018, egg thymine concentrations were close to that threshold level at Waukegan and Milwaukee. So here are the egg densities, and other than this one year where we hit 366 at Little Traverse Bay, we're not even close to that 500 eggs per meter squared target level for all the other sampling times and places. And again, with the thymine concentrations, and we did get an update from Don Tillett at the Columbia Environmental Research Center that we're now up to 2018, which is good news. And it looks like Don's going to be cooperative in the upcoming years and getting that thymine data to us at a reasonable time. We're over the limit or the threshold of 4 nanomoles per gram, 2005 to 2018 in general, but we do see that we're flirting with that level at Milwaukee in 2018 and in Waukegan at 2018. So in summary, natural reproduction by lake trout in Lake Michigan has substantially increased during the past 15 years. This increase in lake trout natural reproduction has coincided with reduced alewife abundance in the lake. Based on the Great Lakes Mass Marking Program, 38% of the lake trout in Lake Michigan in 2019 were wild fish. Based on the gillnet assessment sampling, 21% of the lake trout in 2019 were wild, and the actual number is probably somewhere in between, so maybe 30%. And then of these wild fish, the greatest natural reproduction seems to be occurring in Illinois waters, followed by MM7 and 8, 6 maybe as well, and then the Southern Refuge. Natural reproduction in the northern waters remains relatively low. Annual mortality rate remains well below the target level in WI 3, 4, and 5. And the good news is we're getting closer and closer to that target level in MM1, 2, and 3. The evaluation objective 1 of the spring CPE of meeting or exceeding 25 fish per 1,000 feet of net is not being met on a lake-wide basis, although we do see sometimes at the Southern Refuge, we do exceed that 25 fish target level. Averaging across the lake, lake trout CPU in the fall has exceeded 50 fish per 1,000 feet of net since 1998. On a lake-wide basis, we're certainly meeting that evaluation objective of at least 25% of the fall spawner catch being female, and the evaluation objective of 10 age groups or more exceeding age 7 has been documented at the Southern Refuge, Julian's Reef, Waukegan Reef, and Sturgeon Bay, and we're getting closer to that benchmark in MM3, MM4, and MM5. And that's all I have for this presentation. I'll be glad to answer questions.